more appropriately called brambles, but brambles does not include strawberries. So we're going to, hold on a second. Where is it? Okay, where is it? Can you see that?
Yep, it loaded up. You're good.
Okay, I have to start from the beginning, not in the middle of the talk. Well, okay. Okay, so as I said, we're going to talk about small fruits in your garden, and that include mainly brambles. What we call brambles in general is raspberries and blackberries. But also everybody wants to grow and eat strawberries. Strawberries are not considered a bramble, but it's a small fruit that we all talk about. So we're going to talk about mainly of those three groups. I mean, strawberries, blackberries, and raspberries in this talk. See if you can learn a little bit to grow them in your garden. So as Sarah says, I'm Ramon Arancibia. I'm a horticulture specialist with the University of Missouri Extension. And there you have my information if you have any questions later on. And by the way, you can ask questions. I would rather you to write them in the chat if you have access to the chat in the Zoom meeting. If not, we'll stop at the end and answer questions as we go. So let's see here. So the objectives of tonight would be to describe the characteristics of brambles and strawberries, explain the pruning requirements of both type of crops, compare and contrast production requirement or production systems, and recognize a few factors that can limit production of these crops. Particularly, we're talking about diseases and insects that may affect your crops, and you have to be aware of those. Yeah, we like to grow a lot of things, but we have to be aware that not everything is easy. A lot of people think that growing crops are easy. Yeah, growing fruits in our garden is easy. And if you have experience, you probably know that it's not that easy. You might want to know a lot of things or learn a few things about crops that you grow. So as I mentioned before, brambles are mainly raspberries, red, and there are several types of raspberry: red raspberry, black raspberry, not to confuse with blackberries. There's different things, different species of crops. And then we can talk about blackberries, and there's different type: erect, semi-erect, and trailing or trellising type of blackberries. And of course, many researchers have crossed these two these two species, and there are many hybrids that have been developed that have a characteristic of both of them. Yeah, way to improve the production. The main difference among those, the growth habits are pretty much similar, a few differences, but the main difference between blackberries and raspberry is that the raspberry does not hold. You see in this one, there is a cavity inside the fruit. Actually, it's not one fruit. There are many fruitlets in between around there. Same with the blackberry. Each of those balls is one fruitlet, but the cavity inside that's where the fruitlets are attached to. That is called chorus. And in the case of raspberry, that chorus is detached. When you pick the fruit, it remains in the plant and not with the fruit. In contrast with the blackberries, you detach the whole thing and you have with the berry that chorus in the case of blackberries. So it's something to keep in mind to differentiate the type of fruits. So growth habits in general that you want to keep in mind when you grow blackberries and brambles and raspberries. These are cane type of plants, and they are perennials, but the perennial part is only the crown and the roots. Yeah. The top part, the canes, are not perennial. They're 2 years, they're biennial, which means they're gonna grow 1 year. Most of them do not produce flowers and fruits in the first year, and that's what we call them primocane. Yeah, you see the biennial canes. Primocanes is the first year growth, usually do not produce flowers and fruit. There are exceptions, and we're going to go about those later on. And then the second year of growth, those primocanes become floricanes because they produce flowers and fruit in the second year. And then after you harvest them, that canes died at the end of the season. And if you want to rejuvenate, you want to get rid of those dead canes when you grow these type of brambles. And that picture shows you a little bit, a lot of things about the structure of the brambles. Yeah, you have the crown, the roots, buds there, because the new cane every year come canes from the bottom, from underground. They come new growth that you have to take care of them, because those are the primocane that will become floricanes in the second year. And we're going to talk about lateral branches later on, and tipping some of the primocanes to promote lateral growth. So again, growth habits, the floricane is in the second year. Those are the ones that produce fruit and the second year of growth, and the flower, the fruiting, and then they died. And those are the ones that you have to remove at the end of the season. The primocane is the first year, but there are some varieties that those primocanes can bear fruit at the end of the season in the fall. So they flower late in the summer and produce fruit in the fall. They're called everbearing, but they still last only 2 years. So the first year they can bear fruit. The fruiting portion may die on top of the cane, and from the bottom it can produce lateral shoots that will produce in the second year. And then after that, the cane will die, and you will have to remove it to rejuvenate the plant. Planting material usually are shoots, side shoots that come out of them. You can get them with roots. You separate them and plant them in the field in your new planting. When you already have a planting, this is not important. This new growth will become your primocane. So in the planting material, when you establish a little growth for your hedgerows or wherever you want to plant them in your garden, you want to keep this type of crowns with roots and canes. Yeah, you can find in the nurseries can sell you tissue culture that you have to acclimate to planting in the field, or sometimes the nursery will do that for you. But those tissue cultures are more recommended because they're tested for disease-free and clean, so they don't have diseases or pests. You start with a clean material. And usually the planting, when you establish a planting, is usually early in the spring, in May, after the danger of freeze or frost has passed. Site selection for any crop you want, brambles or strawberries, you want full sun, well-drained soils. None of these crops like wet feet. That means they don't like when water accumulate in the soil and saturate the soil. The roots don't like that. Remember that roots also need oxygen, so it's not good to have a saturated soil that won't allow oxygen or air for the roots to breathe. When we talk about soil characteristics, normally we look for the pH and amount of organic matter. The pH is a measurement of acidity, alkalinity, and most plants have a very good range, a specific range where they can grow. In the case of these brambles, it usually 6.5 is a optimal pH range. When the pH goes above that, we have to amend the soil to reduce the pH And when the pH is lower than that, we want to put lime to raise the pH. And we recommend usually to do a soil test to see where you are in your soil, and that will give you the recommendations of what to do to amend and improve your soil for a particular crop. It's important to know what was grown in that crop, in that site before. You don't want to plant where has been already brambles or strawberries in that soil again. We usually recommend a long-term rotation to avoid accumulation of soil-borne diseases. So if the soil comes from crops that are not related to the Rosacea family that these crops are, strawberry, brambles, and raspberry, blackberries, as well as apples and pears, those are in the Rosacea family. You don't want to plant in an area where has been trees, apples, pears, or even peaches in that soil. You want to avoid that. So you want to know what happens before that. And if you're planning for yourself, you don't have to worry about marketing. But if you're planning to grow, to go and sell in the farmer's market or elsewhere, you might want to know what your clientele wants to buy, what kind of fruit, the type of fruit, and you can select at what time, and you can select the varieties appropriate for your market. So preparation, as I mentioned before, you want to eliminate all perennial weeds. Yeah, those are more difficult to control, to manage. Modify the soil pH, as I mentioned before. And you can fertilize, adding potassium or phosphorus before planting is a good thing. Normally, potassium and phosphorus does not wash away, so you can apply those before planting. Nitrogen, on the contrary, is very easy to lose it by deep percolation or runoff, and or even weeds are going to consume that. So usually nitrogen is better to apply each year after planting. Organic matter addition, if you want to improve the soil, the higher the organic matter, the better. Yeah, so you can, this time before planting, you might want to apply add organic matter. And one thing that we do recommend strongly is to use raised beds or ridge rows, so the plant is above ground or above where the water would accumulate in a heavy rain. Yeah, you've seen that pictures that trying to raise that row or bed to allow for to be much higher than the rest of the plant, so there would be a good drainage. And in general, I would recommend for these plants 10 to 12 or even 15 inches high, particularly with the brambles. You want to go 1.5 feet or so high because they're more perennial. In the case of strawberry, there are two types of, we're going to talk about that later, but the two types of plantings. I mean, if it's an annual planting, you renovate that, you change it every year, and the bed needs to be quite a bit high, probably a foot or more high to maintain a good drainage. Spacings of the brambles, usually, it depends on the type, usually, but normally rows can be separated by 10 to 12 feet. Yeah, then the spacing between plants in the row can, depending on the type of bramble, for example, raspberry can be 1.5 to 2 feet. Other ones can go 2 to 4 feet. And in certain type, like the semi-erect blackberries, they can be 6 feet apart in the row because they grow fast and vigorous, and you're gonna trellis and guide those canes throughout the row to have a covered crop. You cover the whole row with those. We're gonna see that later on pruning. But those are recommended planting distances. I mean, and make sure you understand the difference between rows, center to center, and within rows, plant to plant in one row. Yes. And normally when you plant, establish the crop is usually early in the spring. Uh, all these crops we recommend, highly recommend use irrigation. They need 1.5 to 2 inches per week. And when we talk about 2 inches, it's inches per acre or inches per surface area. When you do drip irrigation, it's a different way of calculating, but they do need in the middle of the summer practically irrigation every day to maintain the root area, the root volume moist enough. And I want you to understand when I say most does not mean overwatering. Trickle irrigation or drip irrigation works great, and that's what we recommend. And the schedule in that case is very, we could talk for an hour in scheduling irrigation, but normally is when the plants are small, it's probably 10, 20 minutes a day. But when the plants are large in the middle of production, in the middle of the summer, it could be 2 or 3 hours a day. Yeah. So it's important to understand how much irrigation would be. The other part of irrigation is what is the source of water. Normally in Missouri, if you use well water, it may be high pH, alkaline water, and that is not very good for plants because it's going to raise the pH of the soil. So you might want to test the soil, test the water, and maybe be prepared to do adjustment if the pH goes too way high. And for that, there are ways to amend that. As I mentioned before, you put sulfur to lower the pH before planting, but after planting, you might have to use other type of acidification in the irrigation water. Fertilizing, hold on. Yeah. Fertilization normally is pre-planned depending on the soil test. So that's what we recommend to do the test, and that will give you a recommendation. Likely one, what is probably recommended most likely is about a half a pound of 12, 12, 12 per 10 feet of row. You don't want to put the fertilizer straight on top of the plant. You have to spread it around the plant. Yeah. So, and then subsequent years about the same amount, 1 pound in this case, 12, 12, 12 per 10 feet of 5 plant. If you don't know what 12, 12, 12 mean, that shows the percentage of each of the three main nutrients that the fertilizer has. All nutrients, macro, and micronutrients are important, but normally fertilizers bring the three main ones that are added in larger amount. And the first number is for nitrogen, the second number is for phosphorus, and the third number is for potassium. Different type of formulation may have different numbers or different concentration of each of those three elements. So you want to make sure to understand that to calculate how much fertilizer you need depending on the recommendation. Raspberry, we talked a little bit. There are two types, summer bearing. We talked about that. Those are the ones that produce in the second year. And the fall bearing are the ones that produce the primocane in the first year. And do you have different varieties in there for this particular crop? And the blackberries are also the same type of things. Blackberries, there are some other varieties there, Bristol, Blackhawk. These are mainly recommended for Missouri. So you can, I might put you, or I'll give Sarah some link to some production literature information, so you all can have, if you want to review in more detail this presentation. Blackberries are a little tougher than raspberry. They like a little more warmer temperatures than raspberries, but both of them are susceptible to low temperatures, particularly hard freezes. In the case of blackberries, there's a lot of thorny varieties of blackberries, that, like the ones that we see there, Shawnee, Chickasaw, Kiowa, Darrow, etc. There are some erect thornless. A lot of people like the thornless blackberries because, of course, without thorns, you don't hurt yourself. And there are some names there, Arapaho, Apache, and Navajo. There are the eastern semi-erect blackberries, some varieties there. So it depends how big you want your planting or how well you want to manage. Some of these varieties produce the fruit early and some of them produce it later. So if you want to extend the harvest season, you might want to select several of them. Yeah. Pruning raspberry, in general, pruning all of them, all of the brambles is you want to find first which one is your primocane, which one is your floricane. So all floricanes usually are removed in the winter after the harvest. That means at the end of the second year. Yeah. You thin them after you get rid of the primocanes, the floricanes, you leave only primocanes, the ones that have grown the first year, 1 year growth at the end of the season. Those are the ones that are going to produce flowers and fruit in the next spring. And you want to thin them up to 3 to 4 canes per square foot, or depending on how many plants do you have, or how much is the distance of those plants, you might leave a few more or a few less. Yeah, the important part is you select the strongest one, not the weak ones. You eliminate the weak ones that have not gotten the size of the tall enough. And the fall-bearing fruit, those are the primocanes that are going to end up flowering. And usually, you could, in the case of raspberry, a lot of people remove them all after the flower. You could leave them for the spring production, either whether it's a raspberry or a blackberry. But a lot of time, those produce much less fruit in the spring. They produce some in the fall and some in the spring, but the yield, the total yield, is much less than those that wait for the floricane for the second year. But if it's in a garden and you want to have some fruit in the fall, you might want to select those. And if you leave it over the winter, there you might get fruit in the spring again. Or you keep the floricanes for the spring from other varieties. Training and pruning, you prune a black raspberry or erect blackberry. These are the two types. They're pretty similar. These are for the primocane. You tip them in the early summer to promote lateral shoots, so you will have more branches that will produce more flowers and more fruit. Yeah, not the case of primocanes that will produce in the fall. You don't tip those. You only tip the primocanes that are not going to produce fruit the first year. They're going to produce all the fruit in the second year. So you remove the floricanes after harvest, but you tip the primocanes, those that grew in that year, and thin them to 3 to 6 per plant in the case of blackberries, or 6 per square foot in blackberries. And once in the winter, those lateral shoots, you might want to shorten it a little bit. Normally, the tip of that last growth is not going to handle the winter. They're too succulent, and they're not going to be able to produce good fruit or flowers. This is a look of what it means when you tip those primocanes, and then the lateral shoots start to grow. So you see those lateral shoots are the ones that are going to produce most of the fruit. And you're going to have a lot more when you have more lateral shoots. And this is how it looks in the winter or fall in the other picture. Yeah. Actually, that is in the spring. You see all the dragon weeds in there, and they're coming. So that looks those are coming out in the spring. Trellis system for brambles. There are many types of trellis system. There are the 2-wire trellis system. That's the most common one. There's support hedgerow trellising. There is a rotating cross-arm trellis system. That one is more expensive, but very functional, very useful. Why do we want to trellis? There are some functions. You want to control the plant size, height, and the cane spread. You want to tie them up so they won't fall and keep them upright. Facilitate cultural operations. If you want to improve insect and disease control by spraying, that helps a lot. Helps in harvesting, yeah, and facilitate the harvest, the picking of the fruit. So as I mentioned before, there's several types, but the true wire trellis system is the common one. And you see there how it's been arranged in this case. Sometimes you have a T on the post and you have two wires at the same height on two sides, so the plants can handle in the middle, grows in the middle and fall over those wires. This is a review, I mean, a fast estimation, I mean, a very, how can I say, estimation that could vary a lot depending on how do you manage those plants or how healthy they are. If they've been fertilized and watered appropriately, you can get about this amount of food per plant. Yeah, for different type of crops. And if you see the thornless blackberry has a much higher yield per plant, but that's because they're planted further apart. That's why the plant is larger and you can get a higher yield. But it's good to know how much should you expect from those plants. We're going to talk about some limiting factors. Of course, temperature often is too hot, might affect the fruit setting. As I mentioned before, they're sensitive to wet soil that could promote root rot. And of course, when you harvest, you want to eat them practically the same day or next day because storing those fruit, they're very perishable. Yeah, you can, in the fridge, they can last a week or so, but it's better to have them fresh. As I mentioned before, cold injury, hard freeze can kill the bud. Yeah, especially when the hard freeze come early in the fall or early winter, it can kill those buds because they have not adapted to cold temperatures yet. They're not fully adapted. So it might happen. And no long, I think a couple of years ago, we have a very low production of blackberries because of the hard freeze that we had in December. And that killed most of the buds of those varieties that were not adapted to the cold yet. So there is some risk of that, and you're gonna see those plants that they might sprout in the spring, but they're not gonna have flowers or fruits. So if you see that picture in the left, the left bud is green and white is healthy. The black center on the right bud there is that bud is dead. That flower bud is dead, and it's not gonna have a fruit that spring. And the other picture shows how badly it could be when the sprouts cannot come in. They died in the spring. I mean, during the winter because of freeze. Some diseases. I mean, as I mentioned before, any crop might think is easy to grow. Usually it takes time to learn about the crops and about the problems of the crops. And once you learn, that learning curve will teach you a lot of things. It becomes more easy, but for beginners, you have to expect that it's going to be a lot of problems. It's not that easy when you're a beginner. There's a few examples. There are 3 examples there of the diseases. The top picture is the grain mold that attack the fruit, anthracnose that attack the cane, and fruit too. There are other type of blights and diseases. The orange rust is that one that has the in the leaf there, and underneath the leaf that rust in there, and mention other fruits. Phytophthora root rot attacking the roots, especially when it's a wet soil. Verticillium wilt attack through the roots and will clog the vessels, so that's why it's called a weed. It doesn't let the sap go upwards and the plant wilts. And other diseases that are, and these are not all the problems or the diseases that you can find in a crop, but just to let you know which ones, these are the most important ones that you have to be aware of. Insects, of course, insects are all over, everywhere. And for blackberries and even raspberries and strawberries, Drosophila, spotted wing Drosophila is a fly, it's a tiny fly that put the eggs in the fruit, and the worm, little worm, will feed in the fruit, and that's the damage of the fruit from this fly. It's a very, very important fly, I mean, insect that would affect your crop. You have here in the bottom picture the Japanese beetle. You have the other beetle, the green June beetle on top right. You have the red-necked cane borer. You have this other worm that is the raspberry crown borer. That's a very important in brambles, raspberries and blackberries, because it will burrow the bottom of the cane, and that cane will die. So you lose the whole cane because of this worm in there. So it's very important to know what the problems that you might be subjected to learn how to identify them and manage them to get a good crop. Weed management, like in any crop, you want to make sure that you have a good management. Normally, we recommend to keep a good control of weed in the row, and between rows you can have grasses, and that you can mow constantly to keep them low. So the main part is controlling weeds in the row. But as an alternative, you can use plastic culture, you see here, and the crop is, I mean, when you plant, you put that plastic, that's a special type of plastic, is thick, is the type of the ground cover plastic. So it lasts for many years. I've seen that type of plastic to last 10, 15 years. So it's a little more expensive than the thin plastic that we use in most crops, but this one will last a lot. So it is worth it to pay a little more for it to keep the row free of weeds. And that's what we have for brambles, raspberry, and blackberries. Is there any questions so far about that? If you don't have any question, then we'll go with strawberry. Yeah. Or if you think of a question, just put it in the chat and we'll address it at the end of the presentation. Well, a lot of people like strawberries. I love them. I love them, all of them. But strawberry is another crop that a lot of people like and like to grow them too. And why do we grow strawberries, and why we grow raspberries and blackberries? Because we like them, because it's a fruit that is desired. Yeah, it's relatively easy to grow. The same questions are with the brambles. One might think that is easy, but when you see all the problems and what it means, it's not that easy. But once you learn how to grow them and you know the routine, it becomes much easier to grow them. Same with the brambles. Yeah, the cons of the strawberries, and probably a few of them with the brambles too. In the case of strawberries, it's a short-lived plant. In certain type of crops, it can be a longer lived if you manage it that way. We're gonna go in more details about that, but in relative term, each plant is a short-lived plant. It requires a lot of labor, that's for sure. Strawberries require a lot of labor, a lot of work. Plants are like any plants, any crop are vulnerable to environmental problems, temperatures, and we're going to see some of that, diseases, pests and diseases, and weed management. So just like we talked about brambles, strawberries also have those problems. There are many ways to grow strawberries in the garden. As you see here, people have become very smart in growing them in different ways. And anyway, if you take care of them, you're going to bear good fruit that you're going to enjoy. Yeah. And you may find a lot of these that in the market, they promote you, they want you to buy their system. A lot of them work, a lot of them may not work so good. The important part is for them to work, you have to pay attention, attend them, water them continuously or as it requires, fertilize them at the right time with the right amount of fertilizer, and make sure that the soil is clean, anything is not, there are not diseases or soil-borne diseases. The thing is, you saw those type of growing, as I mentioned before, you can grow them at home, but we're going to talk about the most used type of product. So that can be used at home as well as commercially. Yeah. And in general, is there two types, what we call the annual hill production system. That's a newer system that uses plastic culture. It uses double bed rows like you see in the top picture, and uses what we call day neutral or short date varieties of cultivars, which are a little different than the old varieties that we're used to do in the other system. The perennial matter road system is the old system and is being replaced by the annual hill production. And the main thing is that the annual hill production, as it says annual, you grow them in this space in this site once, and you do not grow them there next year. You remove the whole crop and you plant again all over in another site. In the perennial, it can last in the same site 4 to 6 years, depending how healthy is the crop. It could last longer or less, depending on how you manage it and how healthy it is. Of course, it requires wider roads or beds in comparison to the the annual hill production. And it usually uses short day cultivars, or what we call June-bearing cultivars. And we're gonna see why as we see when they're planted and how they're planted. So here you have some varieties for each system that are more appropriate, depending on what kind of a cultivar is. And usually, as I mentioned before, the planting season for the perennial mat rows is you plant in the spring. You do not expect fruiting that year, that spring. The fruiting comes the spring after, a year from planting. In contrast, the annual hill production, as I mentioned, is just 1 year. You plant in the fall, early in the fall, not very late, because you need that plant to be established and settle in the ground. And then in the next spring, after the winter, it will bear all the fruit. And after you finish harvesting, you get rid of that crop and start all over again in another site. So for the perennial mat production, matting production, you plant in the spring and you produce a year after. And the annual hill crops, you plant in the fall and you bear fruits the spring after the winter. Yeah. So harvest is late through May, through June in the spring for most of the cultivars. There are different timing depending on the cultivar, but you have that whole range. If you have many varieties, you can have a wide range of harvesting, so you extend your harvest season and you can enjoy for a longer time the fruit. A little bit about what the structure of the raspberry. usually you have the mother plant. This is the plant that you plant first. Yeah. Whether in the fall or in the spring, that's the plant that you're gonna plant. When you plant in the fall, you don't want them to grow stolons, these runner or stolons, and produce new plants. You are waiting for this plant, mother plant, to establish itself, go into the winter, induce a flowering to have flowers in the next spring that you can harvest. When you plant in the spring for the matted system, you plant this when you get, if it flower that spring, you don't want those fruit. If you let those fruit grow, it's gonna weaken this plant. When you plant in the spring, you want to produce as much stolons and daughter plants that you can root up in the fall to be able, those are the ones, the daughter plants, once it's established in the fall, summer, fall, these are the ones that are going to induce flowering during the winter, during the cold period, and produce fruit the next spring. Yeah. And we're going to talk about how this can be managed. You don't expect the mother plant to produce the fruit in the next spring. It's the daughter plants the one that is going to produce. A lot of people leave the mother plant too, but when it gets too crowded, these fruits are going to be very small. So you don't want very crowded plants. You want to thin them up so you can have larger fruit. The fruit per plants, more fruit per plants of larger size. And that's one of the difference with the annual hill, that you have less plants so they can have more foliage and more flowers of good size fruit, because they're not competing to each other. Planting strawberries, there are two types of planting. You can use bare root plantings. Usually those are the ones that are planted in the spring for the perennial matted row system. But when you plant in the fall, late summer or fall, you want to use plugs because those plants are actively growing. And that's something that you want to do in the fall. You want the plant to be active so they can establish in the soil fast enough to grow a little bit, accumulate reserve to pass the winter, and have a good crop in the next spring. Yeah, that's what is important. But remember, when you plant in the fall, sometimes the warm temperatures, you may plant too early, and warm temperatures are going to induce those plants to produce runners and new plants. You do not want that. So you might want to be aware and remove those runners so the plant can accumulate reserve into the crown of the mother plant only. You do not want runners at that time. So it will have a good, strong reserve for the spring to bloom and have good amount of fruits. How deep you want to plant, whether it's a bare roots or plugs, you want to plant it at the right depth, like you see here. When it's too deep, it might start to rot the crown or the foliage stems. Or if it's too above ground, the roots are going to get sunlight, some scald in there, may die, and not going to be a good plant. So you have to cover the root, but not the whole crown. Commercial growers use equipment to prepare the soil. If you have a small piece of land, you don't need to, but it is important. We do recommend to use plastic mulches, particularly for the annual hill production, to reduce weed management. The plastic will help you not to be bending all the time to weed the crop. Yeah, relies on plastic mulch, and the recommendation is to use drip irrigation between the two rows of plants. Even when you have one in the matted system, you can use a drip irrigation too. You can increase the organic matter. It's good to have organic matter. you can grow them organically. That means with no chemical pesticides or no chemical fertilizers. You have to look into that system, what is allowed or not allowed in organic production system. But you can grow them. There are publications that you can look into that too. So the annual hill, as I mentioned before, is planted in late summer, early fall. 2 or 4 rows per bed. If you have a wider bed, you can have a wider bed and you put 4 rows per bed instead of 2. Most of the commercial production just use 2 rows per bed, as you see in that picture. In the case of the home garden, those rows can be shorter. You can put the plastic manually. You want to make sure you raise the bed to improve drainage, so it can be done. It's not complicated in that sense, but it requires work. It requires time. So again, we're still in the annual hill production. Those are the recommendation of planting distances. Usually, the distance between rows or distance between beds, it could be 6 foot center to center bed, and or 4 to 5 feet center to center bed. And then you have here on the side the distance between plant, 24 to 28 inches between the 2 rows, or 12 to 18 inches, when you have 4 rows. And between plants in the road, 12 to 14 inches. In the case of having 4 rows per bed, you might want to put two drip lines for irrigation, so the water can reach all the plants, not just a few. And drip irrigation can be done whether directly from your faucet, or you can arrange for a gravity system. A lot of people, small farmers, do gravity system. But if you have in your bag and the pressure of the water that you have, if you have a pump or if you have city water, would be enough. For drip irrigation, you would need to have a pressure regulator, because the drip irrigation tape cannot handle more than 12 psi. So keep that in consideration if you drip irrigation, to study or to learn the system, and the pressure of the city water is too much. And if you have a pump, the pressure of that pump might be too much, so you need a pressure regulator. Again, whether annual hill production or the matted system, you want to protect the crop for the winter and early spring. In the winter, usually they use straw. Growers use straw. You can use straw too. You buy a bale of straw and cover them pretty good, 2 to 6 inches of clean straw. Or you can use a floating spoon-bonded row cover like you see in the bottom. They sell small pieces in the stores too, for small backyard growers too. It will help to protect the plants against freezes. Especially in the spring, when the plant is flowering, that's the most sensitive time for the flower to cold temperature. The foliage can resist light freezing. It can get to 25, and the foliage will have no problem. But the flower will freeze below 32 degrees. And you see that picture in the bottom left. The flowers that are yellow in the inside, those are good in shape flowers. In this particular plant, those flowers after the freeze. But you see the bottom flowers here, they're older, they suffer with a freeze problem. And you see the center of the flower is all black because they're dead. This is a very critical time to protect against freezes or even frost. And it's good to cover them with a straw or row covers. And if you can keep them under a low tunnel or even in a high tunnel, even better. The protection would be even better. So we talked about the annual production system, annual yield production system. Now the perennial matter road is mentioned already, is planted in the spring. The same type of, the bare roots type of crowns that are dormant when you plant it, so they will come up in the spring. The planting distance are a little bit different in here. You're gonna plant rows that are much further apart, just one row, and the distance between plants is much more larger, much spaced out than in the annual yield production. Yeah, it can be. It's not good to use plastic in this system because you're gonna use those stolons, the daughter plants, to root them out. So if you have plastic, you won't be able to root them back out. So this particular system is not good to use it with plastic. But you can do a drip tape with them, at least at the planting and the initial planting. Later on, when the plants grow away from the mother plants, you might need to use other type of sprinkler irrigation. But if you manage to maintain the plants, the daughter plants, within the distance of the drip irrigation on the bed, you might be able to do drip irrigation, maybe one or maybe two drip per row or per bed, let's say. So when you plant this in the spring, you want to remove the blossom to promote this plant to grow strong and promote daughter plants, because those are the ones that you're gonna put in the ground for rooting, and those are the ones that are going to produce fruit the next spring. So here you have a picture of how those plants are producing stolons, or all those lines that you see downwards, they are growing away from the mother plant. And when the soil gets wet, they're gonna root at that site. Now, before they root, you might wanna rearrange. You don't want that many plants around, because the next spring is going to become too crowded and they're gonna compete each other. So you might want to remove some of them. And this is a picture of how to, if they go too far apart, you bring them back to fill up empty areas. And you essentially leave about 2 to 5 daughter plants per linear foot on that particular bed. Yeah. If the bed is wider, you can leave more plants and widen it up to fill up the wider space. But if your bed is narrow, you don't want to leave more than 2 or 3 plants per linear foot. So all depends on how wide is your bed. You want to fill the surface, but you don't want to get crowded in there. You want to keep those plants separated at least 8 to 12 inches apart from one plant to another. Because when they produce the foliage, they're gonna widen it up and they cover a good amount of space. And the more space per plant, the better the quality of the fruit that you're going to get. The more crowded are the plants, the more plants, you're gonna get more fruit, but smaller size, much smaller size. So you have to find a balance on the density of that planting. Yeah. So the mother plant, in certain cases, once the daughter plants have been positioned in the right places and once have been rooted, you can eliminate the mother plant, or you can leave it for 1 more year. But since this type of row, the mother row is perennially lasts for many years, eventually at the second year, you wanna thin the plants up. You don't want that mother plant to last more than 2 years. So you're gonna have to thin up a lot of plants to allow the plants that you leave at the end of the season, you leave a few after the harvest, it comes the renovation, you get rid of a lot of plants, you leave a few of the plants in the middle of the road to produce new daughter plants for the next spring to produce. So at the end of the harvest, be aware that you're going to have to get rid of most of the plant and leave mainly a row that will produce daughter plants, runners and daughter plants that can be rooted on the side of the bed to fill up the bed, and those are the ones that are going to produce in the next spring. And the same process is every year. So you will renovate with new daughter plants. You get rid of the older plants and leave the newer plants. So the planting is rejuvenating every year. Early spring cleanup. This is a managing renovation after harvest, what I was mentioned before. So early spring, before they produce the flowers, you want to get rid of all dead tissue from the year before or during the winter, because that dead tissue may have diseases, and those are the source of inoculum to infect the new growth. So you want to clean up before flowering, before the shooting or the sprouting early in the spring. So the planting is going to be clean and healthy. And then after harvest, you renovate, you weed, you narrow the road to 6 inches or strips. 6-inch strip, depending on how much. All the plants are not going to be straight road. They're going to be kind of a different places side by side. So you reduce the width of the road, thin out the bed by removing old plants, mow the bed in between beds, let's say, or even the bed if needed. If there are dead tissue, you want to get rid of that. Fertilize the bed, rake soil over the bed, so you will clean from weeds, and keep the bed well watered, so those plants that are left grow strong and produce new daughter plants. Again, the same thing as I mentioned before. In the winter, you want to protect them so they won't lose all the foliage. But if they lose the foliage, that's okay. They're going to come back in the spring. But the main time to protect them is during flowering. The same thing as I mentioned before. The flower is the most susceptible part against cold temperature. So winter protection, mulch, floating blankets or rock covers. In the spring, after removing the hay mulch, you use a floating blanket or rock cover to protect against the flowers against cold. There are other systems. You can grow indoors. There's plenty of, in the internet, there's plenty of people that will offer you to grow any crop and strawberries indoors. That means a lot of knowledge, a lot of practice. These are pretty big systems. There are small systems. I had a hydroponic system. I didn't grow strawberries, I grew other crops, but those hydroponic small systems can work for strawberries too. You can use low and high tunnels to protect them, net houses, or for the summer, or greenhouses, indoors, hydroponic. You can grow strawberries anywhere practically, providing the conditions, light and temperature and water and nutrients. So a comparative summary between the annual hill production system and the perennial matting row or matted row. Essentially, as I mentioned before, the annual is 1 year and you get rid of it and plant again all over in another site. It's a large investment. It's a higher risk, particularly for a commercial production. Small margin of error. For homeowners, they can do this. Probably you have to invest a little bit, but it would be better managed, because the use of plastic, it will allow you not to spend much time in weeding. Yeah, it will manage the weed. You will manage the weeds much better when you use plastic culture. And the same with watering. Drip irrigation would help you a lot. Nowadays, you can find automatic drip irrigation in any store, or Home Depot or Lowe's, any garden store that can sell you a system. Of course, it's going to cost you a little bit of money, but it gives you how can I say, you don't have to spend much time in the garden. Make sure that the plants are watered. You set it up, and they're gonna water automatically. You have to check on diseases and pests to make sure you manage those. But the use of irrigation and plasticulture is very helpful. As I mentioned, because you use plasticulture, you have a better weed control with the mulches. They're higher yield, they produce higher yield because you put the plants at the exact distance that research has shown that those distances between plants are the best for higher yield and good quality crop fruit. You get early and longer harvest season depending on if you use several varieties. You can have a long season of harvest. Some varieties are earlier, some varieties produce later. And some varieties keep flowering for a while, even if it's the same variety. Fruit that not touch the soil, that is important. When you use plastic, the fruit will not touch the soil. And a lot of diseases is when the fruit touch the soil. That becomes the diseases. And they're easier to harvest. In the matted system, well, it lasts several years, cheaper to grow. You need less plants because you are propagating the plant from those initial plants. But you have less risk, a smaller investment, but you have to work a little more in making sure that the daughter plants get rooted, and then making sure to thin them up so you have the right amount of plants so they won't compete with each other. Yeah. In general, they have lower yield, and that's because of competition. And the quality of the fruit is lower because of competition. Yeah. But if you manage them good enough and taking care and thin them good enough, you may have good quality yields, quality fruit and yields too. Because of the varieties, they're more concentrated in the spring than the annual system. And because you don't use plastic, the fruit is going to be touching the soil, and they're going to be more prone to rots. Mm-hmm. So those are the things that you have to keep in consideration. And other things that you have to keep in consideration, the same as when we talk about brambles, the site selection, you want to have full sun, not in a shady area. The more sun, the better. If you have shade, well, that's what you have, but the more sun that they can have, the better. Close to a source of water, of course. You want to test your soil characteristics so you can amend it as is needed. Well-drained soil, slightly acid, 6 to 6.5. We talk about the pH. pH can be amended and fixed with sulfur or sulfate fertilizer to reduce pH, or lime to increase pH. I will strongly, before you do this, strongly do a test, because the test will tell you how much of each of these amendments you can use. If you use too much sulfur or sulfate fertilizer, you may reduce the pH too much, and it's not going to be good for the plant. And if you use too much lime, the same thing, the pH is going to go way up, and it's not going to do good for to the plant. Good amount of organic matter. Organic matter is always good. The higher, the better. And moderately fertile soil. Other points: avoid low areas prone to frost in the spring, temperature inversion, as well as low areas usually are more wet. And that's what you don't want. You want to pick at higher elevated areas so there's good drainage. Don't want water accumulating in those where your crop is. Eliminate perennial weeds before planting. Those are the most difficult to eliminate, like Johnson grass, sedge. You want to eliminate those before planting. And strongly recommend raised ridge or a raised bed or ridge rows, 10 inches or more tall, to improve drainage and soil aeration. For fertilization, soil test, apply amendments of fertilizer as needed, depending on the recommendation. Fertilize as needed, plant spring, etc. Pre-planting, they're gonna give you a recommendation if you submit the sample before planting, and then they can give you recommendations after planting, especially in brambles. In brambles, usually after planting, I mean the second, third year, we usually do tissue analysis instead of soil analysis. In the case of strawberries, if you do every year, you do soil analysis before planting. But in the perennial matter system, you can do tissue analysis too. Early season and pre-harvest fertilization based on leaf tissue analysis for perennial or more than 1 year crop. Irrigation, I talked a little bit about irrigation already, drip irrigation and advantages, efficient use of limited water supplies, fewer disease problems when especially if you are on plastic, but even if you don't have plastic, as long as the soil is dry, it will be less problems. But if it rains, it's gonna wet the whole soil. And if the fruit is touching the soil, you're gonna have more problems, yeah. Disadvantages for drip irrigation require clean water. So well water has to go through a filter to be able to use it in drip irrigation. City water is already clean, so it's practically no problem. But if you have a well water, likely is pulling out sand. And if you use pond water, likely has a lot of algae. So you're gonna need to use some kind of filter for that. Requires clean water, potential for damage by animals. Yes, that's one of the problems with drip irrigation. If the tape is exposed like you see there, birds are gonna come, especially when it's dry and it hasn't rained, birds are gonna come and look for the water that drip line is when you're watering, and they're gonna punch that drip line trying to get to the water. So harvest, you wanna harvest the strawberries when they're fully red. Same with the brambles when they're fully ripe and red. Unfortunately, when that time comes, likely the fly, the Drosophila, might have already infected the fruit. So you have to be aware and avoid or do something to control those flies. But the best harvest time is when they're fully red, yeah, without white strip. Pick with the stem attached early in the morning. Why? Because the food is cooler early in the morning, and you can store it it will last a little longer. If you harvest in the middle of the day, they're hot, and you might need to cool it down. Harvest at regular intervals, yes. One that may have a little bit of white, you're not going to harvest that day. It might be ready by the end of the day or next morning. So you have to practically harvest, if not every day, every other day to get all the fruit out. Harvest into sale, well, that if you are a commercial grower, you put them straight in your sale container. Yeah, if you keep it for home, you can harvest straight in where you're gonna present it to your family, so everybody can enjoy them. So remember, all these fruit are perishable. So if you harvest, refrigerate as soon as possible, so you can keep a longer shelf life. Store properly in a cold room. Yield varies with a location, production system, cultivar. So I already mentioned the two systems. It's going to give you different quality of fruit as well as a yield. And depending on how well do you manage the pest and disease. But about 1 quart per plant in the annual yield production is acceptable yield. Yeah, if you grow in a pot, likely you might have that amount. Some people could have more than that if they keep If the thing is, strawberries, if the temperature is cool enough during flowering, they keep producing flowers. If it gets too warm, they stop producing flowers and they start producing stolons and daughter plants. So you have to be aware a short spring may give you a short harvest season. If the cool spring is extended, you might extend the harvest season because the plant keeps producing flowers. And you have to be aware of that and protect those flowers and fruits. Pest management is similar to brambles. We use what we call the IPM for disease insects and animals. The IPM means integrated pest management, where it's not just about using pesticides. You have to learn a little bit about the diseases and the insects so you can sanitize your crop or your area of production. I mentioned before in renovation, and to clean the plants and the area from dead tissue early in the spring before flowering, before the plant resprout. So you get rid of all that dead tissue because that's the source of inoculum of diseases. So that will give you a much healthier plant. Yeah. Use these resistant varieties. That is important nowadays. When you buy varieties, you might find that the seller, the company that is selling, can indicate you which varieties are resistant to some diseases. Not all varieties are resistant to all diseases, but you can find out what diseases are they resistant to, and you look for the ones that you may have or the ones that you have that are more common to find everywhere. For example, botrytis or anthracnose, those are everywhere. So healthy plants have fewer problems and avoid favorable conditions for diseases to develop. So that's one of the main things to look into. And what are those diseases? Wet plants. You don't want to sprinkler irrigate these plants mainly. And if you have to sprinkle irrigation, you have to do it in a sunny day in the morning so they have the rest of the day to dry out. You don't want to sprinkle irrigate in the evening because the water will stay for a longer time at night, and that promotes infection from diseases. And this is why I recommend to do drip irrigation, because when to drip irrigate, you do not wet the foliage. Of course, if it rains and the rain stay on cloudy days and rain for a long time, the plants are going to be more susceptible to disease infection or incidents. But you can do whatever you can do to avoid wetting the plant. That is important. And sometimes you don't have a solution that you might have to spray with a fungicide or something to avoid the problem. But that is what we call the spraying is the last resort. There are diseases that you may have to do it as a preventative way, but is the last resort. In the case of insects, you spray when you see the insects, although certain insects like Drosophila, you practically won't see them until they have infected the fruit. There's some pictures about diseases. This is what you see here is mostly gray mold or botrytis. The bottom one is look like more like the bottom right, like anthracnose. That's another type of infection. So you want to reduce sanitation to reduce inoculum, remove the stolons and dead foliage in the fall. You leave the plants in the fall, the plants that you want to leave at the right space, not very dense, for the early spring production, but you remove most of the dead tissue, the leaf, and dead plants, old plants, you remove them from the area. You can use mulching to avoid freeze problems. Use raised bed, as I mentioned, to promote drainage. and monitor environmental condition and fungicides application when it's necessary, particularly when during flowering. This is a sample of one of the diseases, leaf spot diseases, what you see here, those spots, round spot that you see there. And the big part is when those spots coalesce and make a big blight of the whole, dye the whole area. So these are the ones that I want to mention. When they're dead, you don't see the spots, but likely they have been infected with this disease, and you want to get rid of all this dead tissue and get them out of the area. Hopefully better to burn them before or bury them deep in the soil, not just superficially. Do not pile them in an area where you think, oh, they're gonna decompose. No, that's not the way. The foliage might decompose, but the disease is still there. Same when you do compost. Composting is not the same as decomposition. Compost requires a temperature that will kill most of the pathogens. We're talking about 130, 150 degrees in the compost pile. If you just pile the vegetative material in there, they're not going to reach that temperature, and the diseases are going to still around in there, and you're just recycling the source of inoculum. So if you're going to compost, make sure you reach those high temperatures. Otherwise, either burn the material or bury them deep in the soil. So cleaning, removal of infected and dead leaves in early spring and after renovation. And you can use fungicide applications too. Other type of diseases in strawberries, red steel, which is Phytophthora, that will kill the whole plant. There are resistant varieties. Verticillium wilt is a wilt that means it attacks the crown and it will not allow the sap to move upwards, so it will kill the plant too. Leather rot is another type of Phytophthora. You can use fungicide for that. And black rot too, complex disease. Avoid soil with history. Commercial growers will have to fumigate. You can soil steaming, that is expensive, or you can solarize a little bit. Yeah, solarization will help, but it's not a silver bullet. There are viruses and phytoplasmas. Those, if the plant is infected, there is no way to get rid of the problem. Usually you see that by stunting growth, malformation, chlorosis, and there is no cure. Pests, we have worms, spring, fall, foliage, and the worms eat anything practically. This particular picture, I got it in a production system, organic production, and curiously, they put straw in the fall too early, and crickets get in the planting and protect themselves under the straw over winter, and they came back in the spring and started to eat all the seed of the fruit. If you see those shells in the plastic, those are shells from the seed that the cricket were cracking and eating. Yeah, but the crickets also can eat the fruit, as you see in this case here. They can eat the fruit. They like the seed, but they eat the fruit too. This is a case for slugs. You see the top picture, there's a slug eating the fruit. And the bottom one, it's hard to see, but it has larvae from the spotted wing Drosophila. That's the fly that will get to the fruit. And the larva is inside, so you won't be able to see it until you bite in it. Other pests, the birds, you see a turtle in the bottom picture eating the strawberries, birds picking on it, mice also like them. They're very, I mean, mice can get to it because the crop is low, and turtles can get it too because they can walk and get to the fruit. So they're very easy for them. And just like us, they like them. It's sweet, they're tasty, they like them too. So that's all what I have for today. If you have questions.
Thank you, Ramon. I think there is one question in the chat if you didn't get to it yet.
Let's see if I can get to it. Let me see. Let's stop sharing it here. I started with a fall annual hill production planting a strawberry bed, but then left them in the ground. Is it possible to turn it in a perennial bed now? How long ago did you plant it? In this spring, you should be expecting flowers and fruit. But later, after the harvest, you might be able to leave it for perennial production if you don't have plastic. So the daughter plants later in the summer would be able to touch the ground, and you can help them to make a little hole to put them in there and keep that soil wet, so the daughter plant will root down in the soil. So yes, you can if there is no plastic in between. But remember that when you do this, you move into the matted system, you have to get rid of the old plant. You leave the newer plants only. Yeah, the daughter plants. Will you only get fruit from the daughter strawberry plants, or can you pinch them off and keep the mother plants as the primary plant? Normally you could, but normally it's not recommended, because the mother plant, once it has produced fruit, it has less reserves, and is spending all the reserves and all what they photosynthesizes in growing the daughter plants. So at the end of the season, those mother plants are in weaker situation than the daughter plant. Secondly, they may already have some diseases in the crown. So you don't want to keep those plants. You want to get rid of them and have the newer plant, the daughter plants, that are expected to have less problems than the mother plant. Okay, so those are the two questions that I see. So if you go into the evaluation, I'm gonna give Sarah some links to publications, so you can all have, if you want to read a little more details about these productions of brambles and strawberries. And if you have any other question, please type it in the chat and we'll look for it.
Thank you, Ramon. Yeah, just send them my way and I'll send them out, those
Okay.
publications. That sounds great.
All right then. See you next time.
Sounds good. Thank you all for coming.